First of all, thank you all very much for coming. And I know it wasn't just for the food. I know you really are really deeply interested in the issue, and you should be, because it's a very, very important issue. My name is Leslie Page. I'm the Vice President for Policy and Communication at Citizens Against Government Waste. If you don't know who we are a taxpayer watchdog group. We have been around since the Reagan administration. We were formed right during the Reagan administration, actually, as a government waste watchdog. You may, and I'll just give you a quick recap because most people know this already, maybe. Reagan, when he first came into office, wanted to try and make the government run more efficiently. So he actually tapped thousands of people in the private sector who came to Washington and gave 2 years of their time at no cost to the taxpayers to kind of audit the federal government and give us an opportunity to find waste, fraud, abuse, mismanagement. And 2 years later, they presented a very, very voluminous report, which fills an entire wall of our office with lots and lots of recommendations, over 4,000 of them, some of which have been implemented. We're still fighting the battle, though. And since then, we've been around, what is that now, 24 years? And we are a 501c3, 501c4 as well, which is when we advocate for various legislative and other initiatives, we have a 501c4 under which we operate. And so that's one of the reasons we've become very interested in this issue, is because this is probably one of the most epidemic and emblematic issues of government waste that we've seen in a long time. It's right in, I mean, you'd say it's right in our wheelhouse, but it's right in everybody's wheelhouse. The Treasury Inspector General for Tax Administration actually estimates that we will probably be losing between 20 and 26 billion. I think that number's probably been a little fluid lately, but it's going to be potentially $20 billion over the next 5 years in taxpayer refund fraud. What now it has its own acronym, which is Stolen Identity Refund Fraud. And what this is specifically is unscrupulous actors, criminals, thieves, prey on the weak and the vulnerable, and people and they steal social security numbers and individual tax identification numbers, and file these folks' tax returns early on in the season before these people realize they've even had, maybe in any case haven't even realized they've been ripped off. They get these tax returns back. Sometimes they're in an average of $2,000 to $3,000 per tax return. They come back in either check form or electronic debit cards. And the thieves are often running with the money before these folks even realize they have been ripped off. It's a lot of money. It's growing. The thieves are more brazen. They're more sophisticated. And they're more organized. I think we can definitely say that. And interestingly enough, the timing of this is good, because on, I guess it was Thursday of last week, the TIGTA, which is the Treasury's Inspector General report, came out with 2 reports on Thursday. One about the detection methods that the IRS is trying to put into place to identify and prevent this from happening. The best way to do it is to handle it at the door, basically, to stop it from happening, rather than trying to chase the money down afterwards, which is very dangerous. It's also very expensive, and we're losing that battle, I think it's safe to say. So there's 2 reports, and they're in your packets. One is about the detection that the IRS is trying to put into place. They've put in a lot of new filters. I think they started with 11 a couple of years ago. They're now up to about 80 new filters, which is a way of identifying suspicious returns based on data, like a lot of data mining in terms of identity, whether the Social Security numbers have been compromised in the past, whether they've been used before, whether this is a deceased person, et cetera, et cetera. So they're adding new filters all the time and and they are making progress. Actually, this report that came out shows that they have, and this is a little confusing, they actually found about $4.4 billion worth of undetected, suspicious, potentially fraudulent returns. So that means that the IG looked at all these returns, looked at the data, and saw a lot of returns, $4.4 billion worth, that were not detected by the IRS. I think that's the correct way to say it. That's 1.1 million returns, incidentally. And in this report, which I thought was one of the more interesting statements, is that the IRS does not actually know how much they're losing, and they don't exactly know how much of this is going on. And that ought to really be a scary idea, because that means this is just the tip of the iceberg. The other report that came out, also very important, is the way that the IRS is handling the victims of this crime. And what we discovered in that report is that the resolution of these cases takes on average of 312 days. You know, so the thieves are off and running, buying flat panel televisions or whatever they're doing with the money. In the meantime, these poor people have to wait 312 days on average, according to Taxpayer Advocate. Nina Olson's office has sent us a representative today to talk about that as well. Thank you very much to Nina. And thank you, Chris, for coming. So we basically have, and what I thought was also interesting was of the 312 days that were spent supposedly resolving these cases, the IG found that 277 of those days there was very little actually going on at the IRS. Meaning people are sitting around for almost a year waiting for their returns to be resolved to get the money that they're owed or to, you know, to have it all resolved. And at the IRS's level, on average, 277 of those days, there's not much going on up here in Washington or in the IRS bureaucracy. So, you know, there's good news and but there's worse news. The good news is the filters seem to be working. Things are, you know, it looks like there's some, they're having more prevention techniques actually work, but the bad news is these bad guys are getting very, very sophisticated and aggressive and very organized. I had notes, but I'm not going to go into it because I've got experts right here who can do this for me. I thought the first thing that we should hear from is a person who's actually had this happen to them. So our first guest and our first panelist is going to be Detective Paul Williams, who has been a detective for 18 years in the Davie, Florida Police Department. He's now a detective in the Violent Crimes Unit. He himself has been a victim of this fraud and can talk to you about the experience, what it's been like to be on the other side. And in addition to which, Florida is an epicenter of this particular crime. And continues to be, although it is spreading across the country. And Detective Williams can talk about what he's seeing on the ground in Florida in terms of trying to stem the tide. Thank you. Detective Williams, going.
Hey, good afternoon. Thanks for putting this thing together, Leslie. I think this is something that's very important. Like she said, my name is Paul Williams. I'm a detective with the Davie Police Department. It's located in Broward County, just west of Fort Lauderdale. I've been a police officer for about 18 years. In addition to my responsibilities as a police detective now, I'm also the president of our police union. I became a victim of identity theft dating back in 2010. What had happened was, sitting around in my office, I started noticing that some of my partners were calling the IRS. They had got notified that they had been victims of tax refund fraud. And what had happened is, in the course of calling them, their last names were A, B's, and C's, and being the smart detective that I am, I could put it together that my last name was Williams, and I'm probably going to be next. So what I did is I called the IRS. After trying to get a hold of them, several phone calls, they would only take a few of us at a time. When we were sitting around the office trying to pass the phone, they disconnected the phone. We had to call back, wait like 28 minutes before we get a hold of the next one. I told them that, listen, this is what's going on. We had a compromise in our office, through our pension administrator's office. We found out that there was a burglary. They broke in and stole a laptop that contained all of the law enforcement officers' identification, social security numbers, and everything. You're talking about, we have 175 sworn officers, and in 2010 there was about 109 of us that got compromised. Anyway, what happened is when I called the IRS, the most frustrating thing for me when I became a victim, and everybody thinks that law enforcement officers aren't victims of these things, and I called them and I told them, listen, this is what's coming. I know it's coming. Can you do something to put a block on my account? Can you do something to prevent this from happening to me? And their response was, no, we can't. And that was very frustrating for me, telling them that, you know, it's almost like a victim when they come to me, they're victims of a crime, and they tell me, listen, I know this is what's going to happen. There's a pattern of violence that's continuing. And I try to tell the IRS that, and they were like, no, there's nothing we can do. They said, the only thing we recommend to you is go ahead and hurry up and get your tax return filed in a quick amount of time. So within 2 days, I got it filed on my account and tried to send it off electronically, and he had been told that right in his office that had been compromised. That was 2010's return. 2011's return, I was compromised once again. And this last year, 2012, I was a victim of it once again, even though the IRS sent me a PIN number, which they say is not supposed to, you're not supposed to be the victim of. It kind of goes in further into that. Now, with my social security number being out there, groups have filed unemployment, filed for unemployment not only on myself but on other officers, and it goes on and on. I have to paper file for the next 7 years. And I've been told that I still haven't got my 2012 tax return back, and I was told that it, you know, may take some time for them to figure it out. Interestingly enough, when I called up the IRS, I tried to tell them, listen, I'm a law enforcement officer. Is there any information you can share with me, because I'm on the ground in South Florida? I know that's like the center of all this stuff going on. Can you give me any leads, anything I can follow up, anything I can help you do to resolve this? Because it was important to me, not only the president of our union, but also as a victim myself, to try to help bring this to some kind of resolution. And they shared absolutely no information with us in the local level whatsoever. When I came home one afternoon, I had a letter from the IRS. And when I opened up that letter, on the inside of the letter was addressed to me at a North Miami address, explaining to me how not to be a victim of tax fraud. So what the IRS had done is they sent it to, I actually went to this address in North Miami, and it was a vacant home, which I'm assuming is where they sent my fraudulent return to. And it was interesting how kind of goofed up they messed up the whole process, where they sent it to me thinking that I was the victim, but at the wrong address, if that makes sense to you, what I just spieled out. So we got contacted by actually Brian Williams. It was a show, Rock Center, it was on, and we were, our officers were featured on the show Rock Center back in March of this year. Yeah, Rock Center with Brian Williams.
30 Rock.
30 Rock, right.
NBC.
And Kate Snow was actually the reporter who really took an interest in this case. She interviewed some detectives in Tampa, and they went around this piece, and they actually showed how criminals would much rather do tax fraud than do any kind of armed robberies, any kind of drug transactions. It's safe. They don't have to worry about carrying weapons. They don't have to worry about enhanced penalties. I know in the state of Florida, you carry a gun, the enhancement on any kind of crime jumps up. This is something they're doing from their computers. They can sit around and, I don't want to put the negative moniker on it, but they sit around and they smoke weed and they drink and they sit at the computer and they file all these tax returns, and they can get these things done in 5 minutes. Interestingly enough, part of my responsibilities in a detective, I got called out one night about 2:30 in the morning. We had a shooting call. I went to an apartment complex. It's on the east side of our city, where patrol officers had responded, and they encountered people running and jumping out of a second-story window after neighbors had reported hearing shots of gunfire. When the officers went to the door, on the front door, they observed blood pattern, like swipes on the front door. As they creaked open the door, there was blood on the inside of the house. So they backed out, called for detectives. When I showed up, did a walk through the house. Nobody was around. There was obviously some bullets sitting on the floor. Somebody was a victim of a gunshot. People had jumped out of a second-story apartment window to the ground, and there was nobody around, no victims, no suspects, nothing whatsoever. And walking through and searching this two-bedroom house, our two-bedroom apartment, there was 19 computers and iPads sitting around with stacks of notebook papers with names and identifications of people. What they were doing is they were sitting around there, they were doing tax fraud, entering this information right in the computer. Thus, what we later found out is inside a safe, there was about $10,000 to the back of a bottom of a safe, which I'm assuming the people who broke into the house or did the home invasion didn't notice it there because they cleaned out everything that was on the top. And they probably knew that that's what these people were doing here. That's where they had the large stash of cash and the money, and they were holding it. And they took off with whatever money they could, and still to this day, we've had nothing. We ended up calling the IRS that night. They didn't want to come out. We were told to bring everything and hold what we had, and they would come pick it up the next morning. I still have not heard what is going on with that part of the investigation. It's really an epidemic down there because not only are law enforcement the victims, but it's also they prey on the elderly. They prey on anybody can be a victim walking around there. They've made it so easy with technology and the computers. Unfortunately, they get these green dot cards and they're going right to these ATMs and they're sitting there and cashing it out, and they're taking all the money, and these people are long gone before we can even track it. That's pretty much my story and my spiel, and the reason why I got invited up here to speak to you all, and hopefully this gets some attention it needs so the victims can really get help, because unfortunately I'm doing all right, but the people who really need and depend on this money really need to get it. So
We'll do
that's it.
Q&A in a minute, yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Detective Williams. That's pretty harrowing. And be safe, because that sounds like some pretty aggressive people involved in this, and it's probably, I have a question over here.
Just a quick question.
Sure.
Excuse me, thank you.
You want to turn your...
You're saying the same thing that I've heard at other briefings this year on IRS healthcare fraud. The question is your sense that this is organized crime? Is that something that at one of the briefings I attended, they think that this is really organized crime that is the guilty culprit here? Do you have any sense on that?
I don't know if you can say organized crime in the sense that what everybody thinks, like the Gambinos and organized crime families, but it's certainly, there's an organization, there's a hierarchy. We've seized property and materials that have come out of jails, teaching people how to obtain victims' identification numbers. You can buy them online. There is an organization to it. There's a method to their madness. That sense, it's definitely organized by a group of criminals. to commit this act, but it's not the organized crime, which I think most people, when you put that moniker out there, it's, they think like the Gambino crime families and stuff like that, but it's the next big thing. I know the piece we did with Rock Center or 30 Rock, they said that this is the next thing since like cocaine. They haven't seen like a big influx like this since the cocaine first, and you can't find cocaine in South Florida anymore, where kilos used to be prevalent. Now this tax return fraud is the #1 crime down there.
And for the reasons you cited, because it's very easy, this we've heard another reason, it's so easy.
Yes.
Thank you.
We're going to have more time for Q&A too, so, don't feel like you get... And I just also want to mention that one of our guests is Steve Toperoff of the Federal Trade Commission, and they are the repository of all kinds of data on financial crime. I think it's just all kind of financial crime, and he's going to be able to talk to us about just how big this has gotten. One of the fascinating factoids that you'll see in this report that TIGTA put out on Thursday is that in some of these charts was fascinating that some of the checks were being sent to Bulgaria. 800, 900 checks being sent to Bulgaria. The next one on the list was Lithuania. 676 checks sent to Lithuania. After that, it was Ireland, and then we start getting into the cities here in the United States, and of course, lots in Florida. Michigan, my home state, has also been a victim where you have one address in Lansing, Michigan. I think it got 2,000 checks sent to it. And this is one of the things that the IRS is struggling with, is the idea of how to identify and to stop these massive checks and or electronic debit cards that are going to one address. I think they're having a really hard time figuring out how to do that, and I understand from the report that they're working on a cluster, some sort of a cluster technique, which is a way of identifying clusters of regional areas that have been getting a lot of checks. From then on, and by the way, just so you know, when you read this report, you'll see quite a bit of redaction in here, and there are reasons for that from security perspective. The IRS does not want to actually telegraph to the bad guys what they're doing. So if you see some sort of redactions in the report, it's only because federal law prohibits the IRS from, revealing information that would actually enable the criminals to do it even better. Having heard from Detective Williams, our next guest is actually from the Taxpayer Advocate's office. It's actually Taxpayer Advocate Service. Christopher Lee, who's a senior attorney. And if you don't know what the Taxpayer Advocate Service is, this is an independent agency that I guess it's within the IRS, but it's completely independent, that actually is an ombudsman for the taxpayer and works for the taxpayer to resolve conflicts and issues that they may have, and I'm sure they've had their hands full with these kinds of cases over the last couple of years, and I'm hoping Chris can tell us a lot more about what you're seeing, and also they're there to also help the IRS and also identify the problems they're having dealing with resolution of these cases. As you can imagine, some people who come forward later with having found out that their identity's been stolen and they haven't gotten their check back have now got to go prove that they are who they say they are and that they are in fact owed this money. And it's taking almost a year in some cases, maybe longer. And these are some of the most vulnerable people in our society. So it's a very tough situation. So let me introduce you to Christopher Lee, and we'll get his perspective on that. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thanks, Leslie. I'll sit here
wanna sit?
if you don't mind.
Absolutely.
As Leslie said,
Sit too if they want.
As Leslie said, I'm Chris Lee. I'm with the Taxpayer Advocate Service. Because we are an independent organization within the IRS, I will be speaking from the perspective of the taxpayer. Our organization was created to help taxpayers resolve problems with the IRS. So taxpayers and victims like Paul, if they haven't had success or dealing with the IRS, they can come to the Taxpayer Advocate Service. And the idea is that we can help push the case through the IRS and resolve the case quicker than one might be able to without our help. We have offices in each of the 50 states, the District of Columbia, in Puerto Rico. So if you or anyone you know have any problems with the IRS, feel free to contact one of our local offices. Identity theft has been a very important issue to the National Taxpayer Advocate. Since 2004, she's included identity theft as a most serious problem faced by taxpayers in her annual report to Congress that's submitted every December. In addition, she's testified at 7 congressional hearings on this subject since the beginning of 2012. ID theft is a very serious intrusion of privacy. So apart from the emotional trauma that's endured by ID theft victims, they have to spend months, maybe even years, trying to unwind the harm and the damage that ID thieves have done to their good name and their credit record. Victims may lose job opportunities. They may be refused loans for cars, homes, or even get arrested for crimes they didn't commit.
Oh, wow.
So with this in mind, we're very troubled by the approach the IRS has taken in resolving ID theft cases. I'm going to talk a little bit about what the IRS has done to prevent ID theft, but the focus of my presentation will be on how the IRS assists victims once they've been victimized. So first, the IRS has made significant strides in trying to develop detection measures to prevent ID theft from the get-go, recognizing that it's much easier to stop money from going out than it is to recover it after it's been paid out. The IRS utilizes a series of ID theft filters that they've developed using data mining. So they analyze years of returns, millions of returns, and if they see something suspicious, like the adjusted gross income fluctuates significantly from year to year, or if a taxpayer suddenly has additional 5 dependents, it will be flagged, and the return won't be paid out until the taxpayer comes in to prove their identity. So that's been going on for a couple of years, and every year the IRS is getting smarter and smarter. So it's going to be it's a work in progress, but they are making strides. Paul also mentioned there's an IP PIN. That's an identity protection personal identification number. That's a 6-digit code that's given to verified victims of ID theft. So the following year, actually, all future years, they'll have to use the 6-digit code in conjunction with their Social Security number for them to file their tax return. And in theory, a perpetrator can't file a return using a victim's SSN number without this 6-digit code. Paul's saying that's not always true, because in his case, he says he was victimized in the second and third year, even after he received the IP PIN. So I gave him my card. We're going to try to find out what happened, because that's I'm surprised that that's occurring. But in theory, this IP PIN is supposed to protect victims when the IRS has verified their identity and their address. The IRS also works with banks and other financial institutions to thwart attempts by ID thieves to defraud the government. So other financial institutions have their own algorithms to detect fraud, and when they contact the IRS, we'll do our own investigation, but most likely we'll agree with their assessment and stop the money from going out. But one thing I wanted to point out, and this is a very significant point, is that under the U.S., under our current filing system, where the filing season it starts in January and ends in April, a lot of taxpayers file, as early as February and expect to get their refunds within a week or two, and that's kind of the expectation that we've set in our country. If we adhere to this system, the IRS really won't be able to effectively combat ID theft, I think, because the IRS has no reason to suspect the first return that comes in is fraudulent, because they haven't received the second return, and we don't get information from the Social Security Administration about wages and withholding until after the filing season. So we have no opportunity to check whether to even suspect that a return is fraudulent. So one thing that we need to consider is if we push back the payment of the refund. So we'll have taxpayers file by April 15, but maybe push back the payment of refunds till later in the year, like August or September. That'll give the IRS a fighting chance to detect fraudulent refunds. That's probably not going to happen anytime soon, but that's something that we need to consider if we really want to put a stop to refund fraud. So now I'm going to talk about the IRS ID theft victim assistance procedures, and the National Taxpayer Advocate has been very critical of the IRS procedures, to be frank. Leslie mentioned that a recent TIGTA report indicated that the IRS takes on average 312 days to resolve an ID theft victim's account. We believe that the IRS can do much better. Taxpayer Advocate, since 2008, when we had 8,000 ID theft cases, our ID theft case load has increased sevenfold. We're at 58,000 ID theft cases in 2013. And now ID theft cases comprise about a quarter of our overall case receipts. So because of this, our case advocates have developed expertise in dealing with ID theft victims, and we've been able to resolve ID theft cases in 78 days, which is a lot better than 312, and I think what taxpayers deserve. What's troubling about the TIGTA report is that 277 days of the 312 were days of inactivity. So once it got in the door, the IRS employees really didn't touch the case. Part of the problem is that there are over 20 different IRS functions that deal with ID theft. And the TIGTA report indicated that on average there are about 10 different IRS assisters that touch the case. And that kind of that's consistent with what we've seen. We've seen the ID theft case have deal with multiple functions in the IRS. So ID theft cases are not very easy to solve, but you can't solve it if no one's looking at it. So what the National Taxpayer Advocate would like the IRS to do is to assign one single IRS employee to be responsible for the overall resolution of the case, especially since these taxpayers are victims and they deserve to be treated as victims, and they don't need to be given the runaround. So the National Taxpayer Advocate recommends that the IRS adopt a similar approach to what TAS uses, and let me just go through how we work our cases. So each taxpayer whose case is accepted into TAS is assigned a single case advocate with a toll-free number and also a toll-free fax number, which eliminates barriers to communication. This case advocate will speak with the taxpayer to gather relevant information and to perform the initial triage. They'll identify which functions in the IRS need to be involved. They'll negotiate timeframes with these functions, and they'll track the IRS responses to make sure that they adhere to the negotiated completion dates. And also, if the case advocate will be unavailable for a certain amount of time, they'll find another case advocate to conduct follow-up actions so the case won't stall. By using these steps, we've been able to resolve cases in 78 days. We've had a relief rate of 89% and a satisfaction rate of 94% from these ID theft victims. So we think our process works. We can't understand why the IRS wouldn't want to adopt such a process. We understand that if there's 20 different functions that need to be involved, that's fine. Keep that on the back end. But from the taxpayer's perspective, assign them one IRS employee, and I think the IRS will find better results. So that's what we're going to recommend in this year's report. We hope the IRS will give this a shot and at least try it as a pilot program and see if their results don't improve, because the current framework is not acceptable.
Thank you, Chris. Can you hear me? Thank you very much. Very interesting. Wow, that's a huge discrepancy, too.
Yes, yes.
I mean, that's a big discrepancy. I mean, 312 days to 78 days, did you say?
Right.
I got to ask a question. I know we're going to move on to Steve in just a second, but I do have a question for you. When you have this many cases identified at the IRS, how can you possibly put one person on it? I mean, that's the thing that amazes me. I mean, they identified, I think TIGTA said they identified 1.1 million potentially fraudulent cases. Now, maybe, it's amazing to me. I mean, I don't know how you could do it.
Yeah, but the number of taxpayers that actually contact the IRS to resolve an account, I mean, these may be compromised, maybe like 1.1 accounts have been compromised, but it's a smaller number of taxpayers that actually have issues they need to resolve with the IRS. So one thing I want to make sure is that we've had a good track record. What we don't want is for the IRS to transfer all 1.1 million cases to us. But
Careful what you wish for.
But the IRS does. They have dedicated. They've devoted more and more resources every year to ID theft. They understand it's a growing problem, but I think they really need to. They do have a centralized unit. They just don't operate as a centralized unit.
Okay. And I'm sure you're going to have more questions for Chris, I hope. And let's move on to Steve. Let me give you Steve's his CV.
Sure.
Steve is an attorney in the Division of Privacy and Identity Protection at the Bureau of Consumer Protection at the Federal Trade Commission. Now, if that is not a perfect government title, long and very. So tell us about what the FTC is. I have to say, when I first spoke to Steve, I was amazed to find out what the FTC's role. I was unaware of just how involved they are in this. So
Sure.
take it away.
Is this on, by the way? Yes?
Lean
We're
forward.
doing, it's on, okay.
Yes.
Well, I appreciate the opportunity to be here and to tell you about the Federal Trade Commission, what our role is in identity theft generally and for tax identity theft specifically. Much of what we do at the Federal Trade Commission when it comes to identity theft issues is rooted in a 1998 federal statute, and that's the Identity Theft and Assumption Deterrence Act. And we call that simply the Identity Theft Act for short. And what it did was basically two things. First, for the first time, it made identity theft a federal crime. And those crimes are investigated and prosecuted primarily by the Justice Department, not the Federal Trade Commission. We're strictly a civil law enforcement agency. But it did give us a unique role, and that is twofold. First, it requires the Federal Trade Commission to be a repository of consumer complaints. And those complaints are either fraud complaints or identity theft complaints. And those are housed in what we call the Consumer Sentinel Network database. It's an online, protected, secure, and confidential database that's available currently to over 2,000 federal, state, and local law enforcement agencies. So if you're with the FBI or you're with Postal Service, whether you're in the DC area or anywhere else, if you're part of this network, you could go online and research and find out where there are victims, look for patterns, that kind of thing. So it's a law enforcement tool. The second requirement of this act, as far as the Federal Trade Commission goes, is we are charged with outreach to consumers and victim assistance. And that manifests itself in several ways. First, we engage in direct victim assistance. So consumers, if they have an identity theft problem, can call the Federal Trade Commission and speak with trained counselors who will advise them on the process. And if we can't help them directly, if it's something that's a little bit more complex, we have a relationship with a nonprofit organization called the Identity Theft Resource Center that's in San Diego, and they will work individually with consumers or taxpayers to help resolve identity theft issues. Also, through the Sentinel network, consumers could enter in directly their own complaint information. And why that's important is as follows. When a consumer enters information into the Sentinel network, they're able to take additional steps and print out basically a summary of what their experience has been, and that's called an identity theft affidavit. And the reason that identity theft affidavit is important is it helps the victim document the crime. And there are federal statutes, such as the Fair Credit Reporting Act, that give consumers certain rights if they're identity theft victims. But in many instances, the specific rights are tied to being able to document your case. And this identity theft affidavit helps along the way. So again, if you're a consumer, you could go to our website, ftc.gov. There is an icon there to enter in complaints, and it will walk you through it. And at the end, you can print out, again, this summary that goes a long way to help document the crime. Another way that the Federal Trade Commission is involved in outreach is directly to the public, and we do that through a wide variety of means. Most of you probably are aware that the Federal Trade Commission has a wealth of information on our website on identity theft as well as other topics. And I just brought, this is the show and tell part of my speech. We have Taking Charge, which is a comprehensive guide for consumers on all forms of identity theft. And again, that's available on our website. But then we have other more specific types of information. So this isn't about tax, but it just gives you an idea. This is Safeguarding Your Child's Future. This is about child identity theft issues. And again, they're available online, but we also have, and they're either in your packet or on the table, these cards that for bulk order. You are able to go in, and it's kind of like shopping at Amazon. You know, you fill out what you want, and there's a shopping cart, and you send it away. And the good news is that it's all free. And it takes about 6 weeks or so to get the information that you may need. In addition, we also engage in a lot of what we'll call train the trainer. So we have any number of presentations during the course of the year, and we try to make good use of this. This is the Guide for Assisting Identity Theft Victims. It's a comprehensive guide that we generally give to legal service providers, attorneys, to help them, in turn, help identity theft victims. This has, again, wealth of information, including relevant statutes, checklists, form letters, anything that an attorney might need in order to help an identity theft victim. I should also mention, I forgot, that many of our materials that are available online are also available in Spanish, so if that's an issue for you as well. Then we also are on the ground. We make any number of presentations in locations throughout the country, making good use of our regional offices. And for example, we were in Florida last year, specifically, in many instances along with congressional staff and partners such as IRS and local law enforcement. And those programs in Florida in particular were held, I believe, in senior centers and other places around the state. Most recently, anybody here from South Carolina? No, okay. Is anybody aware of what happens in South Carolina this year? Okay. Well, I'll tell you. So the Department of Revenue in South Carolina had a breach. And a result of that breach, over 1 million South Carolina residents' Social Security numbers and other information was compromised, along with business information. So we have been actively assisting the good folks in the governor's office and Consumer Affairs office in South Carolina. Other programs are, we were on the ground in Nevada. Nevada held a training program for legal services providers, and we were there to assist. And again, it was kind of like train the trainer, helping them become more aware of identity theft and what they can do to again, help attorneys be more active in resolving identity theft in that state. So again, we have direct assistance, we have many publications, and we're also on the ground. Now turning to tax identity theft specifically, I mentioned that we have the Consumer Sentinel database. And every year, the Federal Trade Commission puts out what we call the Sentinel Network Data Book. And it's a statistical analysis of all the complaints, both fraud complaints and separately identity theft complaints, that were compiled or that were submitted during the course of the previous year. So the next Sentinel Data Book for summarizing 2013 data will probably be out around February or March. But let me give you some statistics from previous years. In 2000, well, first of all, there are about 2 million identity theft complaints in the database so far. And again, that's as of the end of 2012. So I would imagine the number has increased significantly over the course of this year. But in 2010, we found that of the identity theft complaints, 15% pertain to tax. The next year, that increased from 15% to 24.1%. And the following year, 2012, it jumped from 24.1% to 43.4%, almost doubled. So, which basically means that about half of all the identity theft complaints that we receive at the Commission pertain to tax issues. Now, I should mention that we don't use these statistics to indicate prevalence because it's not a scientific survey. Not everybody reports to the Federal Trade Commission. The complaints are not verified. There could be duplicates. So for any number of reasons, we don't project from these statistics what the trend might be. But nonetheless, it's informative. And nonetheless, it's telling what consumers' experiences are. And another fact, where are these complaints coming from? So you've already heard that Florida is kind of ground zero. Well, the top 10 states are Florida, Georgia, California, Michigan, New York, Nevada, Texas, Arizona, Maryland, and Alabama.
So it's everywhere.
So it's pretty much widespread, but those are the top 10 states. Now, in response to the growth of identity theft, the Federal Trade Commission has acted to make consumers more aware on what the resources are that they can take advantage of to try to address their problems. So the first thing that we did was work with IRS to make sure that consumers had basic information. So we started giving out IRS's brochure on tax identity theft, and we made sure that the IRS's website links to the Federal Trade Commission's information. Another thing that we do at the Federal Trade Commission is from year to year, depending upon the need, we focus on specific identity theft issues. So in the past, we focused on child identity theft. We have ongoing relationship with the military, and we do programs about military identity theft, foster youth. A few months ago, we had a webinar specifically for Americans who are blind because there are certain procedures that they could take advantage of to try to resolve identity theft. And basically this coming year, we have decided to focus primarily on tax identity theft. And hopefully you received this in your packet of information. We are designating the week of January 13th through the 17th as Tax Identity Theft Awareness Week. And we intend to have many programs during that week to raise awareness so that consumers aren't blindsided. When they get the letter from the IRS, they'll know how to recognize identity theft, tax identity theft, and what some of the basic steps are to help resolve it. And what we intend to do is work on a few levels. First, at the Federal Trade Commission here at headquarters, we're going to have webinars and a wealth of information on a website that's currently being developed. The website is ftc.gov/tax ID theft. If you go there today, there's not much. It's under construction. But what will be there is a whole, like I said, wealth of information, but very practical steps that organizations can take, congressional staff can take, to put out the word about tax identity theft. For example, we're going to have model articles, model blogs, model tweets that you could use during the week, again, if you want to have a program. And one of the things that we're looking to do is working with congressional staff. So we intend to send out packets of information, both in mail and email, to congressional staff across the country, as well as governors, U.S. attorneys, attorneys general, again, noting the information that we have available. And again, we're thinking through, nothing has been decided yet, but one step we may take is to make ourselves, FTC staff, available to congressional staff, to go through our website, go through the materials that we have for free, go through the different steps that you can take when you're dealing with your constituents who may have problems. So that's pretty much our program. We look forward to working with you. And if you have any questions about Tax Identity Theft Awareness Week and you want to explore with us, the person to contact is Derek Rill, and his information is on the bottom of this flyer. And if you didn't get one, I believe there's more outside on the table.
Yep.
So with that, I'd be happy to answer any questions that you may have.
Thank you very much, Steve. That's amazing amount of stuff you guys are doing over here. And I meant to mention the January 13th through 17th event or the week that's going to be devoted to this, because this will help raise the awareness. So good for you for doing it. I have a question. I'm not even sure if anyone can answer, but I mean, since we are sitting here with a bunch of staff folks from the Hill, I think we should talk about the fact that there are some things that need to be, I mean, if we were to ever be able to resolve, for example, the mismatch issue between and I believe it's a legal mandate that the IRS has got to be under to send those refund checks out as quickly as possible. I mean, how are we going to resolve that with the fact that they are also trying to get matching data in from third parties? And in fact, it was mentioned in the report that it's very, very difficult to get that on in a timely fashion. That requires legislative changes, does it not?
I don't know if it's legislative, but certainly congressional pressure would help figure out how to get the documents in real time from the Social Security Administration. I know for certain employers, the IRS does have arrangements to get that information in real time, but it's not across the board.
Right.
So it would certainly be helpful to have that because, as we mentioned, it's so much harder to get the money back after we've paid it out.
And, very expensive, as we know. But let me ask also, is there questions? We are webcasting, so I'm going to ask if you do have a question, and I'm happy to take all comers. We need someone to bring a mic around for you. So, Alex, why don't you grab this real quick in case we have some brave soul out there that wants to jump in. In the interim, I also should mention that the TIGTA, we also have someone in the audience from TIGTA and at our front table, and although they were unable to send us someone for the panel today, we've got Karen here who's available to give out her business card and take questions from anybody on the staff who has questions about the report, and I highly recommend the report. Both of them, actually, they're excellent, and let's thank TIGTA for doing all the good work that they do on this, by the way. The other issue I wanted to bring up was the issue of law enforcement and being able to coordinate with law enforcement. I understand there's some difficulties with sharing taxpayer information with the law enforcement officials, which may also require some sort of, I understand the IRS has a pilot program that they're doing where they're trying to, in various states, I'm assuming it's Florida, where they're going to actually work with the law enforcement officials, and taxpayers can give a waiver. If you were a victim of this and you give a waiver to the law enforcement folks, they can share, IRS, they can share your information so that these folks on the ground can try and track down the bad guys and get them. But that's still a pilot program.
I'm not aware of anything, but it certainly would help. Most local law enforcements are involved in some sort of state and federal law enforcement, like we have task force officers, the FBI, the Marshal Service, but the IRS is not one that I'm familiar with, but it certainly help. We could follow up on these addresses and
yeah, I mean, it's really disconcerting when you see some of the address, one address getting 2,000 checks or something. And I guess the IRS has been adding more and more filters to try and catch this stuff before it gets to the point where the checks go out. But that's obviously an ongoing challenge for them.
Leslie, I think it started out as a pilot program in Florida, but I believe they've expanded it as of a few months ago. I think it's nationwide now.
Okay, well, that's good news.
And so, yeah, to aid local law enforcement agencies in prosecuting identity theft thieves, the IRS is willing to share information as long as the victim is willing to sign a waiver.
Yeah, I understand there's a legal impediment to that. Section 1603 or
6103. 6103, but IRS counsel gave an opinion saying that the IRS is allowed to share information absent, as long as it doesn't impair tax administration. And I think what the IRS is saying is by giving the information about the perpetrator to the victim, it may cause some unintended consequences. And so the IRS has compromised and said, we'll give it to the law enforcement agency as long as the victim consents.
Give us a waiver.
But they don't want to give the information to the victim in case the victim does something.
Right, understood.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, and this is a problem that we're going to be dealing with for not just this issue, but with a lot of issues coming along in terms of privacy and keeping your identity safe. It's going to be a challenge. I guess we have a question in the back. Can you wait for just for a microphone? Thank you so much. And incidentally, just while we have this second, I want to let you all know that this presentation will be available on our website in its entirety. We will also be, having each presentation of each of our panelists available separately as well. So if you want to watch it again. Yes, sir.
My name is Dylan Handelsman from Senator Levin's office, and I'm looking through kind of the states that it happens in, and I'm wondering if there's a target audience or a target group of people that are being victimized. I originally assumed maybe it's more elderly, but I also noticed a lot of these states have a large population of people from other countries coming in, and if there is a target group of people, have you guys thought of like more maybe efficient ways to kind of focus your campaigns towards those groups?
Well, I'm going to let these folks answer, but I will say that obviously the fact that it's an epicenter in Florida, I mean, seniors, if there's, in fact, in the packet, you've got a report that has them listed who are the most vulnerable populations. Seniors are by far the most vulnerable population. In addition to which, in the new TIGTA report, they also, I think they moved on to start looking at what they call individual taxpayer ID numbers, which are numbers given to people who do not have Social Security numbers. So there are people that may be here working legal or illegally, it doesn't really matter. They get an ID number if they pay taxes. And those, they call them ITINs. That's the kind of the acronym for these numbers. And they also identified $385 million worth of potentially fraudulent returns related to ITINs, which may also be a brand new kind of and growing area. And so you've got basically vulnerable immigrants who may or may not, doesn't even matter whether they're documented or not, they're going to be vulnerable here as well. And also they talk about young people as well, but I think seniors and immigrants are very much vulnerable. And Florida has both, right?
And law enforcement.
Yeah, law enforcement. Although that takes some serious, to go after the law enforcement guys. I mean, that's really brazen in my opinion. But yeah, so I would think that, and please jump in and let me know what else you find. Maybe FTC and you guys have more.
I'll just jump in and agree with you in saying the ideal victim is someone that does not have a filing requirement. So seniors, children, and sometimes deceased.
Yes.
So that the perpetrator isn't caught for a while.
Yeah. And sometimes deceased children.
Oh, wow.
Which happens also.
And that could go on for years.
Yes.
Right? For years and years and years.
Yeah. I think it's a misnomer to try to focus on particular vulnerable groups, because I think potentially everybody is vulnerable. And what we're finding, and not just from the Federal Trade Commission, but from task forces and other groups that we participate in, is that the key to all this is Social Security numbers in large measure. And more Social Security numbers are now vulnerable no matter where you are. So, for example, if you look at prosecutions for tax identity theft by the Justice Department, many of the sources of the Social Security numbers are hospitals, medical facilities, and other types of institutions, banks. And it's not uncommon for thieves to have a crony, a cohort, get a job at a hospital, specifically for the purpose of being able to have access to government records, to the medical records. And so potentially everybody and all of us are vulnerable. That said, what Chris mentioned and others, that thieves tend to go for those who don't have a filing requirement or who aren't necessarily going to file early on. And that does include children and seniors, which is why we had a specific program earlier in the year on senior identity theft, and we had a panel specifically on tax, and Chris was there as well as others to try to hone in and get the messages that we can use for seniors on that.
Thank you for the question. Oh, sorry, go right
From
ahead.
the law enforcement side, I can tell you it's mostly, I can mirror what he says. It's basically, it's a crime of opportunity for most of these people to perpetrate the crime from. Wherever they can get to stack some, like I told you about the apartment we went into, most of that we figured came from medical office. We recently had a clerk of the courts in Broward County, the county where I work. She just pled guilty to tax fraud. So she was looking up Social Security numbers through the records. So I don't think there's really a specific, although they're probably elderly or probably targeted the most, but it kind of runs a gamut.
And I've also seen, and I'll get your questions coming up next, but I've also seen a growing phenomenon of tax preparers themselves. I mean, I don't know how large it is, and maybe the IRS doesn't even know, but it would be an obvious place. And it was mentioned in the report as well that tax preparers, enrolled agents, people who actually are tasked with helping people prepare their taxes, can often be cohorts in in perpetrating the crime. So, yes, sir, in the back.
Hi, my name is Kobe Dolan. I'm with Congresswoman Debbie Wasserman Schultz, and thanks to all three of you, Detective Williams from our district. And when you talk about like the victims, it really can be anyone. You know, your own department has had your identities stolen, and I know our district office has said they've been working to try and help you with that. But thanks to all of you for presenting this information. I think the FTC information can be really helpful to congressional offices. I know down in South Florida, what we do, we hold town halls with our senior groups leading into tax season to make sure that they're aware. And I know you put in a list of legislation in here from various offices. We have one that focuses on the penalties to try and make it more of a deterrent to the criminal. Obviously, there's a lot that needs to be done on the IRS side. There are several bills that deal with that. Nugent has one that deals with the sharing of information between IRS and local.
And that's Richard Nugent of Florida also,
yes,
right?
Ted Nugent.
Ted, not Ted.
Yeah.
Richard. Although,
Right.
I know how Ted Nugent would deal with it.
A lot of really good legislation out there that's very bipartisan. Ours came this close to being law last year, passed through the House. Voice vote. One senator held it up the last day of session. We don't know who. But hopefully we'll get it done this time. We're working with Chairman Goodlatte on the House side, Senator Klobuchar, and I think it's Grassley are the Senate sponsors. But there's so much to be done because it's not just one group. Because you look at the report from the IRS, and what I called out of that is well, they made some progress on stopping fraudulent returns. The number of fraudulent returns almost doubled in just 1 year. So the total number that got away with it went up.
Absolutely.
So there's the risk reward is still much more reward than risk, and we have to do something about that. But I thank you all for all the work that you're doing on that. Taxpayer advocates are so helpful with our constituents in reducing the time. It's very frustrating that it takes as long as it does, and I know a lot of members are really working on this issue, and I'm sure the offices that are here are very concerned about it, and hopefully we'll be able to get some better tools in the toolbox to stop this, because it really, beyond, I mean, there's the impact to our constituents. It's a horrible violation, of your personal identity to have it stolen. It's also billions and billions of dollars flowing out of our treasury that we really can't afford.
Absolutely. Thank you, Kobe, for your comments and your question. And absolutely, in fact, one of the motivations we had for doing this is because we know that there's legislative initiatives having been, introduced by members of Congress, including Representative Wasserman Schultz and others. And we kind of want to light a fire a little bit. I get the feeling like it's not as urgent as it should be. It's a lot of money. There's a huge amount of hardship being imposed on people who don't deserve it, and we need to try and start working together to get some solutions at the front end, rather than putting Detective Williams in the position of having to raid a place with a bunch of computers and people shooting at each other. Yes, sir.
Adam Yeffet, Senator Mark Udall's office. I was wondering, given the massive increase in claims that are coming to the IRS, is the IRS properly staffed with enough qualified people to deal with this number of claims and this increase in the last just few years?
Excellent question.
I think the commission would say no. They could always use more people, but they have. I think they tripled. I don't have the number, but they tripled the number of employees dedicated to resolving ID theft. But that's still not going to be enough to.
I think they thought. I should have this at my fingertips as well. But it's several thousand additional employees were brought over and are in the midst of being trained. My understanding is they're not all trained necessarily, but they are supposedly being more trained up to be able to help identify it at the front end. But there's a lot of other problems. I don't think it's not just the training. My understanding is there's a lot of communication issues between agencies. In fact, one of the things that the Take-Two report I outlined, which I thought was interesting, was that when it comes to ITINs, which are these ID numbers for folks who don't have social security numbers, there is apparently the IRS has really no way of getting information from the when these people either die or they don't need their ITINs anymore. They don't have any way of getting that information, for deceased individuals who use ITINs or who've had them deactivated, which you really ought to deactivate them once the person has no longer any legitimate need for them, but they don't have a way of communicating and receiving that information in any kind of way that's helpful. So I think there's, aside from the resources issue, there's also obviously some communication problems and some, when you say that there's 20 different divisions or departments of the IRS that has to have a hand on this, you can only imagine what's going on behind the scenes in terms of inefficiency, probably.
Right, and how it gets worked. And then you mentioned return preparer fraud, and that's a growing area. Yep. And one thing that is particularly egregious about return preparer fraud is that when the taxpayer is victimized by a trusted return preparer and reports it to the IRS, the IRS won't pay out the refund to the victim, even after they've proven they were not, they were innocent victims. Whereas in ID theft, after 312 days, they'll get their money. Return preparer fraud, the taxpayer is out of luck.
Now, why is that?
We're fighting, and actually, Nina Olson, my boss, has been meeting with the commissioner regularly for the past few weeks on this. And the IRS is going to make a decision, but right now the theory that they're clinging to is the agency theory, and so they're saying the IRS relied on the return preparer as an agent or purported agent of the taxpayer, and so is not obligated to take any blame for processing the refund. Which there's some merit to the argument. But the fact is that the victim is left without any recourse other than to file a civil suit against the preparer, which they won't be able to find because a lot of these preparers aren't really preparers. They're someone that they set up a kiosk at the mall or met at church or is in their apartment building.
Right. So they may not even be licensed.
Oh, they're most likely not licensed.
Yeah, exactly.
And so that would be one step to curtailing is to allow the IRS to regulate return preparers and kind of put the onus on taxpayers to go to a certified preparer.
Correct. And we have and the vast majority, by the way, of these returns are electronically filed, if I'm correct. I mean, that's where a lot of this is. It's coming through the electronic filing system, 90% of it. So it's a whack-a-mole game, and they're ahead of us a little bit here, I think, and we're going to need to play some serious catch-up, which is always the worst possible position to be in because you're always chasing them down after the fact, and so. I'm hoping that everyone will go back to their offices and get very, very urgent about this. Yes, sir.
Good afternoon. Thanks for coming. I'm Keith Nelson with the Committee for Efficient Government. One of the things that we've seen coming out of the IRS, whether it's respect to identity theft or the Earned Income Tax Credit or child care tax credits, is that there's an enormous amount of data that's being collected by the IRS through these returns, and it largely seems that there's not communication going on across platforms or between offices, and the impression is that from the outside is that the IRS is trying to develop data management tools on its own to address these things. Has the IRS explored anything that is available in the private sector, off the shelf, data management, data sifting, to assist you guys in working with this with the load of data that you're managing, or even just checking if a social security number pops up twice, if some other information pops up twice before the money goes out, is there any way to cut this on the front end?
I can't speak to that. I'm not familiar with what the commissioner's side is doing. I do know they did establish an Office of Compliance Analytics about 2 years ago, and they did hire people with experience on the outside, but I don't know the extent of them using private contractors to help them.
I mean, in our next because we'll be doing this again because this is not going anywhere. So we hope to. We would love to bring in some of the private sector people who work on this on the outside, either big data people, but also the private sector folks who do electronic filing of taxes. They might have some insights that they could share with us all, whether or not we want to adopt them, whether the Congress wants to adopt any of those, or whether the IRS wants to tap those folks to come in and help them. I don't know, but I suspect that there's probably some private sector solutions that are being implemented now. But again, we'll do that on our next panel, and I hope to see you all there. Any other questions? Yeah, we think.
On behalf of Citizens Against Government Waste, I just wanted to say that one of the reasons why we have focused on this issue, and I'm sure that you've gleaned it from our presentation today, is that this is a very unique problem in that the fraud occurs and then the rightful recipient comes back and is owed that money as well. It's one of the very unique circumstances where we are having to pay twice. And for those of us at CAGW, that's why it's such a frustratingly egregious problem. So we welcome the assistance from those of you from the Hill and all of your offices. And as has been pointed out, this is a bipartisan issue. It's a no-brainer. We've just got to figure out how to keep that first fraud from happening in the first place, because we're not going to deny the victims their refunds. And you can just see, Leslie mentioned that we're looking at $26 billion worth of additional refund fraud that's going to happen. Unfortunately, in an era when we're talking about trillions of dollars and what have you, that may no longer sound like a big deal, but it is. So we welcome y'all's assistance in helping us to resolve this issue.
Any other questions? Well, let me take an opportunity quickly then to thank you all for coming today. Thank you, Stephen Toperoff. Thank you, Christopher Lee. Thank you for coming up from Florida, Detective Williams, and telling us your story. And thank you all in the audience for such great questions. Go back and let's work on this together.